So you know that feeling you get when you're driving along and a cop pulls into traffic right behind you? And even you know full well that you haven't done anything wrong, you are not only a model driver, but you are in all respects a model citizen. Despite all of that, you get a knot in your stomach. Your heart races a little bit. You sit up a little straighter, maybe grip the wheel a little bit tighter. You check your speed. You check it again. Check it again. You check your rearview mirror over and over to make sure they haven't hit their lights. You start to feel self-conscious about every little thing that you're doing, your hands on the wheel, the way you're driving, the fact that you're being watched. Now, why is that our response to that situation? It's our response because that cop driving in that car behind us wields so much power over us. They can take our day from good to bad like that. I want you to imagine that feeling of being in your car, gripping your wheel, but imagine that feeling everywhere, all the time, not just in your car. Not just on the road, but in the marketplace, in the fields, and in the temple. And not just one cop in a car behind you, but armed soldiers on every corner. Because that was life in cities and large towns like Capernaum under Roman occupation. Soldiers patrolled your streets, they enforced Roman law, they kept people in line, and if they decided to hurt you or arrest you or worse, there was nothing that you could do about it. And the centurion in today's story, he's not just another soldier, he is a man of rank. He commands the troops that enforce Roman rule. He's the one making sure that Rome gets its taxes, the one approving arrests, the one responsible for keeping the people, namely Jesus' people, subdued. So to the Jewish people in Capernaum, this guy is not just part of the system. He is in many respects the system itself. If anyone could be labeled as an enemy, it is this guy right here. And yet when Jesus sees this man, the centurion, he doesn't see an enemy, but rather we're told that he sees something that, quote, amazes him. So what is it about this man that makes Jesus stop in his tracks so? Because clearly it's not the centurion's position that should have made him an object of scorn and not of praise. It's not his religion. The centurion does not follow the God of Israel. It's not even that he particularly understands Jesus' mission. It's more likely that he only knows him by his reputation as an itinerant healer. And yet we are told that Jesus is amazed by what? By this centurion's faith. I tell you the truth, exclaims Jesus, I have not seen faith like this in all of Israel. And that statement right there, that should make us pause. Because when we talk about faith and when we hear Jesus praise this man's faith, I think most of us assume that we already know what he means. Faith is belief. Faith is about having the right theology, affirming the right doctrines, believing all of the right things about God. But the centurion, he ain't got none of that. He's not Jewish. He doesn't worship the God of Israel. He doesn't know the scriptures. And yet Jesus sees in him a faith that amazes him. Which means that what Jesus calls faith is not what we normally think about as faith. So the story begins with this centurion coming to Jesus with a request. Lord, he says, my young servant lies at home in bed, paralyzed and in terrible pain. To which Jesus immediately responds, I will come and heal him. Now, Jesus saying that alone would have been shocking to the Jewish crowds around him, because at the time it was unheard of for any Jew, much less a Jewish rabbi, to enter into the home of a Gentile, much less the home of a Gentile Roman soldier. But before anyone has a chance to react, the centurion interrupts. He says, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. And that's the moment. That's the moment that stops Jesus in his tracks. So what faith does this man have? What does Jesus see in this moment? It's certainly not belief. We have no idea what this Roman centurion believes about anything. But rather what we see in this centurion is simple trust. The centurion trusts Jesus' authority. He trusts that Jesus doesn't need to come to his house. He trusts that Jesus' word alone is enough. And that trust, that simple trust, is what Jesus calls faith. Not certainty, not doctrine, not belonging to the correct religious group, but trusting the way of Jesus enough, just enough to act like it's true. Mm-hmm. That's what faith is. That is the faith that we see on display when the centurion declares, "Say the word, and it will be done." And if Jesus declaring that this Roman centurion's faith more impressive than any he had found in all of Israel wasn't enough to make the good Jews and the crowd around him lose their ever-loving minds, he then turns to them and he says, "Many will come from the east and the west and take their place at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Sounds friendly? And I recognize that this sounds as though Jesus is threatening his fellow Jews with hellfire and damnation if they do not get on board with what he is doing. So I want to be very clear here in saying that that is not what is happening in this passage. And rather, what is happening here is that Jesus is using traditional Jewish imagery to make a radical new point about who is in and who is out. So throughout the Torah, throughout the Old Testament, banquets are a symbol of God's kingdom, a place of joy and celebration and abundance. And the expectation at the time was that Israel, God's chosen people, would be at the center of that feast. But Jesus here is flipping that expectation on its head. He's saying many will come from the east and west, meaning Gentiles, outsiders, the ones who weren't supposed to belong, and they will make their place at God's table. Meanwhile, the insiders, the ones who thought they had a guaranteed seat, may find themselves on the outside. And this will happen not because God is rejecting them, but because they are rejecting this new thing that God is doing. And it's important to note here that the phrase weeping and gnashing of teeth is not a description of torture, but rather it's a description of people in deep mourning and regret. It's a realization that something beautiful was happening and they missed out on it. So Jesus' warning here isn't believe the right things or be cast into the hellfire. His warning is don't be so certain of your place that you close yourself off to what God is doing right in front of you. Because faith is not about who you are or where you come from. It's about whether you're willing to trust what God is doing, even when it surprises you. And that, I think, should make us all stop and think. Because if an outsider saw the truth more clearly than God's own people when Jesus was literally standing there right in front of them, then we maybe need to ask ourselves, where is that same thing happening right now in our own church, in our own lives, in our own world? Which brings me to the story of another moment in history when the ones who should have seen the truth first completely dismissed it. And an outsider, someone they did not take seriously, figured it out before they did. In the name of this particular outsider, it was Ignaz Semmelweis, and that's a Hungarian name, and I don't speak Hungarian, so I apologize for the pronunciation. But at the time, he was a Hungarian physician with an utterly ridiculous idea. It was the 1840s, and Semmelweis was working in a hospital in Vienna that specialized in childbirth. And while that hospital, it should have been a place of joy, it had instead turned into a house of death. Women were dying at an alarming rate from what they called childbed fever, a mysterious infection that killed 1 in 3 mothers after giving birth. And absolutely no one knew why this was happening, although the doctors at the hospital had plenty of pretty wild theories. Some thought that it was bad air circulating throughout the hospital. Some thought it was an imbalance of bodily fluids, a condition existing in the mother's bodies before they had even arrived. Some even thought it was just plain and simple God's judgment, a tragic but unavoidable fate. But this Semmelweis character, he was not convinced. And he started looking for answers when he noticed something strange. So this general hospital in Vienna, it had 2 maternity wards. One was run by midwives, and one was run by doctors. And in the midwives' ward, far fewer women were dying. So Semmelweis noticed this, and he set out to discover why. And at first he looked for the obvious things. Maybe the midwives were using different medications. Maybe they had a better bedside manner. Maybe they spent more time with the mothers. But none of those seemed to explain what was going on. And then he noticed something that he found horrifying. The doctors, unlike the midwives, spent their mornings performing autopsies on the bodies of women who had died. And then, without washing their hands, they went straight to delivering babies. Now, Semmelweis had this radical thought: what if they were carrying something deadly from the corpses to the living mothers? It sounded absurd. The idea that invisible particles from a dead body could be transferred to a living patient, it seemed ridiculous at the time. No one had ever seen germs before. No one believed in bacteria. The whole concept was unthinkable. But still, Semmelweis had to find out, so he ran an experiment. And he ordered some of these doctors to wash their hands with chlorine solution before seeing their patients. And the result? The death rate in the hospital plummeted. Women stopped dying, and that should have changed everything. But the medical establishment, the experts, the insiders, the ones who should have known better and cared the most, they mocked him. You're saying we're the problem, they scoffed. You expect us to believe that something we can't even see is killing people? We are gentlemen. Our hands are clean. They refused to accept it. Doctors took offense at the idea that they were unwittingly responsible for their patient's death, and so they dismissed his findings. Some laughed at him, and some were outright angry. But Semmelweis, he kept fighting for the truth. He published papers, he gave speeches, he pleaded with these doctors to take it seriously. The results of his experiment were undeniable, but they never accepted it. And instead, they forced him out of the hospital. His reputation was in ruins, and he was utterly ridiculed in the medical world. In the end, Semmelweis died alone in an asylum, insane and disgraced, never knowing that years later, his discovery would become the foundation of modern medicine. Even though no one accepted it at the time, he was right all along. But the people who should have listened, the people who should have seen it first, refused to believe. So the question that is ours to wrestle with this morning is, where might we be missing the truth? Who have we already decided can and cannot teach us? Who are we ignoring? Who are we dismissing? Who are we refusing to hear? Not because they are wrong, but because we have already decided that they must be. Maybe it's the coworker whose background makes us skeptical of their ideas. Maybe it's the activist whose passion makes us uncomfortable. Maybe it's the young person who asks questions that we don't really want to answer. And maybe it's the atheist whose kindness looks a lot more like Jesus than ours does. Remember, Jesus wasn't just amazed by the centurion, but he lifted him up as an example. I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. That is not just a compliment, that is a challenge to us. A challenge to open our eyes, a challenge to let go of assumptions, a challenge to stop deciding in advance where truth can and cannot be found. Because God has always been bigger than our boundaries. And if we're not careful, we might miss something amazing simply because we weren't willing to see it. So instead, friends, may we be a people who stay open. May we be a people who listen. May we be a people who welcome the voices we thought could never teach us. And when we do that, may we also be a people who find ourselves amazed, just like Jesus was. Amen.